I acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. I pay my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, elders past and present, of the lands we meet on today, and acknowledge any First Nations people joining us today. I am Vinod Daniel, Chair of AusHeritage. It's a delight to welcome all of you to AusHeritage's annual International Online Symposium for 2025 titled Strategic Planning for Culture and Heritage in Times of Crisis and Uncertainty. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the establishment of AusHeritage. This network of Australian cultural heritage practitioners, including conservation architects, museum experts, materials conservation labs, heritage tourism and interpretation specialists, and academics in museum practice, to name just a few areas of expertise, has worked and nurtured relationships for decades across the Indo-Pacific region. And I'm happy to see so many colleagues online too. AusHeritage is a membership association with a commitment to support good heritage practice, respectful collaborations, and promotion of the significance of heritage throughout the region. More information is on our website, and I encourage you to consider joining. We particularly welcome emerging professionals with a heavily discounted fee. The objectives of today's symposium is to explore some of the issues, challenges, and opportunities relating to strategic long-term planning for cultural heritage in these times of crisis and deep uncertainty about the future. Australian and international experts and practitioners will explore various dimensions of uncertainty in Australia and the Indo-Pacific region, both how they are or may impact cultural and heritage places and collections, and in turn, how culture and heritage can help communities navigate these challenges. What needs to change in a methods of or goals of strategic planning? What new framing should be explored? Now, before I introduce the moderator, let me thank Alex Marsden for her leadership in conceptualizing this, Penny Tripp, Tim, and the excellent logistics team from University of Melbourne, and colleagues from the AusHeritage Board. I also thank all the speakers and panelists for your time and sharing your immense expertise. Thank you. Now, to introduce our moderator for the day, Alex Marsden. Alex is one of the vice chairs of AusHeritage and runs her own company, Alex Marsden Cultural Services. She is also vice chair of ICOM Australia and adjunct professor in public policy at the University of Canberra. She has a diverse background in strategic design, policy development, advocacy, and cultural heritage management. Trained as an historian, she has worked in museums, the not-for-profit sector, state and national heritage agencies, and key national public policy departments. She was also instrumental in establishing AusHeritage. Now, Alex will outline the aims of the symposium and the structure and timing of the two sessions. She will briefly introduce each speaker and manage the Q&A at the end of each session. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Vinod. And hello, everyone. And I'm very happy to moderate again our International Online Symposium for 2025. And I'm delighted to know that over 250 of you have registered, and I really hope most of you are here. It's marvelous to have such interest coming through. Now, please do use the chat function to making comments, respectfully, of course. And then if you have any questions, we're going to have a Q&A box. We have 2 Q&A sessions, and pop your questions in the Q&A box. And there's also the opportunity to uptick to actually vote for your favorite question if you really, really would like that answered, and I'll try and get to that question. The aim today is to tackle the question of how do we plan strategically for heritage and culture for the longer term, when so much of the world is in turmoil. Of course, we have climate change impacts and projected worsening disasters and happening worsening disasters, not just projected. We've got international rivalries, global economic and political instability. We've got that old perennial competing priorities for national expenditures, with culture and heritage so often marginalised, and at times in this country as well. We've got accelerating cultural change, technological change, and AI is everywhere. But of course, there's also an increasing understanding of the strengths of communities and of Indigenous knowledge and practice. There is always change, but the acceleration and uncertainty on so many fronts is, well, actually confronting. And what do all these pressures, uncertainties, and of course opportunities mean for our region and the precious heritage that these generations, our generations, hold in trust? We still need to think ahead and analyse and imagine, to do strategic planning, which, by the way, is different from crafting an organisation's strategic plan. But how do we do that? To explore and discuss these questions, I'm very pleased to be joined by 6 wonderful speakers. The symposium is in 2 sessions. The first is focused on some of the pressures, crises, and opportunities roiling our world. For example, environmental catastrophes, great power competition, etc. And we have 3 keynote speakers who will each speak for 15 minutes on various aspects of the crisis, some implications, and what could be done differently, and probably a few provocations as well. That'll be followed by the Q&A for 20 minutes. The second session, starting at 4:15 p.m, has a panel of 3 heritage practitioners who will explore different aspects of a changed approach to strategic planning for cultural heritage. And there'll be 10 minutes for Q&A after they have spoken. So we have a brilliant lineup for you, and I'm very grateful for their agreement to speak today. And I'll give a short bio as I introduce each speaker, and just final comment to my wonderful speakers, I will be a strict timekeeper. So without further ado, let's kick off session 1, Pressures, Crises and Opportunities, with a presentation by Dr. Nick Bisley. Now, Nick is the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences and Professor of International Relations at La Trobe University. His research and teaching expertise is in Asia's international relations, great power politics, and Australian foreign and defence policy. Nick was the president of the Australasian Council of Deans of Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities between 2022 and 2024, and was elected as a Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs in 2020. He served as the Editor-in-Chief of the Australian Journal of International Affairs between 2013 and 2018, and has been a Senior Research Associate of the International Institute of Strategic Studies and a Visiting Fellow at the East-West Centre in Washington, D.C. He regularly contributes to and is quoted in national and international media, including The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, CNN, and Time magazine. Now, Nick will set the international scene, big regional trends, and some implications. Over to you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I'm afraid I'm the crisis and uncertainty turmoil guy, and I hope not to be too bleak. I wanted to thank Alex and Roger in particular for inviting me to talk to this group. It's a different group from the kinds of defence, intelligence, foreign affairs crowd that I normally speak to, and it's a real privilege to be part of your discussions. I want to start with, I guess, a bit of a scene setter. There's a sense, I think, that every generation has that the period that they're living through is one of unprecedented change. Never before has humanity faced the sort of set of changes that we in our present moment face. The kind of presentism that dominates the sense of perspective. But I think if you feel as if the current moment is one of particular challenge and particularly significant sets of changes, I think it's right. I think this time really is a moment of very significant global challenges, and they are focused in particular on our part of the world, Asia or the Indo-Pacific, depending on how you prefer to style it. I think our moment is one, it's easily the most unstable geopolitical and geoeconomic environment since the 1970s, and I would argue probably the most significant since at least the 1945, 1950s. Why do I say this? I mean, first and most obviously, great power competition is back, and it's back with a pretty significant vengeance. The Cold War ended in 1991. And for probably a decade and a half, there was a sense that we had potentially closed that chapter of human history. There were a sort of liberal utopianism of the 90s and early 2000s that had a sense where scholars and the like would argue that great power competition was gone, major power wars were a thing of the past, the price was too high, our shared interests in economic growth were too significant, and all that was left was to adjust the sort of chess pieces on the board. I think even at the time, people were skeptical as to whether that was the case, but today I don't think anyone would doubt that the shock and horror and risks of great power competition are back with us for a significant period of time. But it's not just that. As Alex alluded to, there's very significant economic shocks that we're experiencing, what feels like on a day-by-day basis. The most visible and sort of dramatic is the transformation of the US from a leader of, broadly speaking, liberal trade, founding member of the GATT, WTO, driving liberalized trade for good or for ill, for multiple generations, has now ripped up the rulebook, ripped up its own free trade agreements, and has become a sort of mercantilist in chief. And not only are we seeing a sort of death of free trade, we don't quite know where things are going literally on a day-by-day basis in the world's largest economy and the most important driver of global trade. It's not just the US, though. China faces the most significant economic headwinds that it has experienced since the reform and opening up period that began in the late 1970s. Globalization is being very significantly reconstituted, again, on an almost day-by-day basis. I think there is a growing consensus in international economic circles that we live in a kind of post-neoliberal period. So the Washington consensus days are behind us, but no one quite knows what's coming. It's clear that economic nationalism is back. What mix of state market national sentiments will prevail over the coming generation is unclear. And there's a very real risk of a kind of deglobalization occurring with some consequences, which I'll talk through in a moment. And even, although I think the sense of this has passed a little bit now, there's even some question marks about the role of the US dollar in the global economy. It's been the most important system of global money since 1945, if not before. And there's a real question as to just how durable that is. And if the US dollar is not the global reserve currency, no one quite knows what global money looks like, although I think that census is receded to some degree. And of course, in Gaza and Ukraine, we have the most visible example that war has returned to global politics. Big, old-fashioned, significant conflicts. Europe's borders have changed through force for the first time in a significant way since the Second World War. And more broadly, I think there's a sense that one of the great norms of the post-Second World War period, that is that you don't expand your borders by force, seems to have broken. And we have an American president talking openly and not jokingly about increasing America's geographic footprint, whether that's through the acquisition of Greenland, Canada, or elsewhere. Nuclear proliferation is on the rise, and that's both what we call in the game kind of horizontal proliferation, that's more countries acquiring nuclear weapons, and then there's vertical proliferation. That's where the countries that have nuclear weapons increase their stockpile, make it more sophisticated, and increase the reach and lethality of that of their arsenals. The big mover here is China, which is currently, roughly fourth or fifth largest nuclear stockpile, depending on how you count it, and has made it very clear its ambitions to have a seat at the very top table with 1,000+ strategic nuclear warheads, aiming to be online by 2030. This is putting it roughly in the bracket of the US and the Russian nuclear force. And then the thing that probably worries me more than anything else, if that's not enough, is the sense of a kind of victimized nationalism married to a sense of populism, or whether that's an authoritarian or a democratic populism, which creates a very febrile political atmosphere, one which supercharges conflicts, which increases risk appetites, reduces political room for maneuver. And as I said at the top, all of this is on the boil globally, but it's in our corner of the world, that's to say Asia more broadly, that is the centerpiece of risk. So that's the big picture. Let me say a few things more specifically about what's happening in Asia within this sort of context. Most immediately, we see visibly a contest or competition for what Asia's future will look like. Asia's three most important powers, China, the United States, and I would emphasize the United States is an Asian power in both economic and military sense. It's the most important military power in the region by some margin, and it's also the most important source of inbound investment into Asia and the largest export market for now. So the US, China, but also India have competing and ultimately irreconcilable visions for the future. It is clear that they are on, to a degree, a collision course, so to speak, for where their future ambitions lie for the region. What we don't know quite yet is the extent to which they're prepared to take risks, pay a price, or even fight wars to ensure that their vision for Asia's future prevails. Given time constraints, I won't get into too much detail about precisely what those visions look like. Suffice to say, in simple terms, the United States wants to retain its position as the dominant power in Asia, militarily and economically speaking. China would like an Asia in which the US is pushed back behind essentially the Hawaiian Islands, and India would like an Asia in which we have a genuinely multipolar balance of power, in which India has a seat at that sort of top table. Each of those visions entails a very different world from the one that we're in, and in which each of the others' vision would have to lose very significantly for that to be achieved. The long-term prospects for this, as I said, is one of, I think, generational competition. Competition at the moment is not being especially well managed. It could be, and there's a way in which that competition could not be as damaging as it might be, but we're a long way from that yet. More specifically, Asia had really since the late 1970s, early 1980s through until fairly recently, a very settled military balance centered on American military dominance. All of the key powers in Asia accepted the fact that America was the preeminent power, and in fact, quietly enjoyed the fact that the US paid a bunch of global regional public goods, keeping sea lanes open and the like, which meant that the countries of Asia could spend less on their militaries and get on with the business of domestic economic nation and domestic economic development and state and nation building, which many of them did to great success. We're now in a period of a very unsettled military balance. America is relatively much less powerful and also much less willing to use force than it has been previously. China is the big mover here. China is now a much more significant military threat to the US than any country in Asia has ever been. But more importantly, that unsettled military balance has created a period of what I would describe as kind of geopolitical opportunism. It is not by accident that Israel and Russia have both felt emboldened to take the steps that they have, both in terms of what occurred in the past 2 years, 3 years in both of those campaigns, but also other steps that they're taking more recently. So think that Russia would launch a drone attack on a NATO member state directly from Russian airspace, not even trying to make it look as if it was accidentally straying from the conflict on Ukraine into Poland recently, is an illustration that Russia does not feel constrained by American military power. And if you think in Asia, which is a place of sort of long-running, significant, risky flashpoints, the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, disputes in the Mekong, disputes between Thailand and Thailand and Cambodia, and of course the very significant unsettled and unresolved border, between India and China. That sense of geopolitical opportunism is extraordinarily dangerous. I think Asia is a place where victimized nationalism is very much a significant part of the political story. The US, I think I won't belabor the point about the extent to which the US presents itself as a victim. It's somewhat genuinely puzzling that the world's richest country feels that it's somehow being ripped off and, in Trump's words, screwed by the rest of the world. But it is a critical part of his political success and his disposition on the global stage. But that same sentiment that the world is out to get it, the world is out to keep it down, animates thinking in Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound in Beijing, where the Communist Party of China's leadership resides and rules over one of the largest countries on the planet. That sense that of the century of shame and humiliation, that the party state's mission is to make China whole again and to defend itself so that it would never again be torn asunder by foreign forces, is really animated by a sense of victimhood. And in India, of course, Prime Minister Modi presents a similar sense of victimization, of nationalism, in which Muslims in particular are pointed out as not part of and a threat to the Hindutva, the Indian nationalism. And that's not to say these political dispositions will remain always as they are, but they present a particularly febrile political moment. Globalization has been extraordinarily beneficial to Asia. The great economic growth of the past 3 or 4 decades, which is without question the greatest period of economic prosperity or rapid economic improvement in economic life chances of at any point in the human story, was made possible by globalization. And as it's being unpicked, as it's being scrambled, as it's being transformed by this economic nationalism, it is very clear that levels of economic growth are going to be much more constrained. And of course, whilst there's a very positive story to be told about what's occurred in Asian economic growth, there remains hundreds of millions of people that are at and below the poverty line, for whom the economic ladder will be kicked out from under them if the economic nationalist sentiment becomes a sort of new normal of the way in which economic relations occur. And then, of course, the other big trend in the region is the changing climate. Asia is a place in which climatic conditions have played havoc with human civilization for as long as people have inhabited the region, whether it's the monsoons of South Asia, whether it's the typhoon cycles of the Western Pacific. These are being transformed kind of before our eyes. And of course, the intensity, the risk, the human damage, and the cost of all of these is already rising. And it is, in all likelihood, going to continue to create an extraordinarily unstable and uncertain interface between the human and the natural environment. So what's the next 5 years likely to look like, given all of this? What I think we said, crisis and challenge. I think I've perhaps over-egged. Well, I don't think I've over-egged it, but I think the sense of crisis and challenge is very real and very significant. On the geopolitical front, I think that over the next 5, even over the next 10 years, a new equilibrium, a new balance of power, a stable geopolitical environment in Asia is extremely unlikely to emerge. I think the kind of turbulence that we've experienced in the past 3 to 4 years is likely, at the very least, to be the new normal, if not become more exacerbated. I think the prospects of the United States and China in particular entering into a period of highly militarized competition with a very strong sort of sense of zero-sum calculation of every minor competition being seen through the lens, as things were during the Cold War, as a victory for you is a loss for me. And that way, and small fights end up being magnified, and a sort of sense of geopolitical sense of proportion is lost by the contestants. And I think an equilibrium and a managed competition, I think, is probably the least likely outcome at this point in time. Second, and related to that, is that the risks of conflict, I think, are rising quite rapidly. And there's 3 ways in which you can see sort of conflicts emerging. One is the accident, and the accident which escalates rapidly, and it's accelerated or exacerbated by that sort of victimized nationalist sentiment that is rife across the region. Think about probably the most likely place in which conflict can occur, and that is Taiwan. Taiwan's standing as a de facto independent state, even though most countries in the world don't recognize it in practice, they do in fact, is seen as this issue for which the PRC is prepared to go to war. And the PRC has made clear, and Xi Jinping has made clear, that this is the sort of old view about the Taiwan crisis, that's the Taiwan status, which is to say, over time, the weight of gravity will inexorably bring Taiwan into the PRC fold. Xi Jinping made a speech on the 1st of January 2019 saying that the Taiwan problem would not be left to the next generation to resolve, leading many to go, oh, there's a sudden acceleration of the timeline for what the Chinese describe as reunification. And I think that's it's not the sense that there's a clock ticking, but it's clear that the priority that the party puts on Taiwan is much higher than it has been before. And we see this in the disposition of military force. China is, and the way in which it's sort of testing and pushing and probing around the PRC, around the Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits. So previously there would be, 10, 15, 20 sorties a year in which the Coast Guard, People's Liberation Air Force, People's Liberation Navy might sort of probe and test and press Taiwanese, partly to see how they'd respond, partly to see what their sort of military planning was like. Last year, there was in excess of 1,000 sorties involving everything from a practice sort of encirclement of the island, indicating what essentially cutting the island off from the rest of the world might look like, a blockade, if you like. There's been tests of the air border that exists, the sort of semi-formal air border that exists, and air defense identification zone, as it's described. And all of these involve risk, and they involve risk. Sometimes it's just theoretical, something could go wrong, but often the Taiwanese Air Force is scrambled to position itself to make clear that this is its air force, its airspace, that it sees the PLA Air Force as
you have another couple of minutes.
Perfect, as intruding, and this creates a prospects of very significant chances of just an accident happening in which one aircraft crashes the other craft, the planes crash, the pilots and flight crew are killed, and that sort of thing can escalate very, very rapidly into a not necessarily uncontrolled conflict, but into a very major military incident. A second problem is cornered great powers, so major powers who are pushed into a corner, whether by bad choices that they've made, and feel that the only way out is to fight. And then the third, as I was alluding to earlier, is a sense of opportunism, that the geopolitical cork is out of the bottle. I think it is no accident that the Cambodia-Thai border dispute flared up into open conflict earlier this year, minor, but it's not nothing, and hundreds of people were killed earlier this year. It's not by accident this has happened now, when there's a sense that they can get away with this sort of thing in a way that they may not have been willing to take that risk in the past. And of course, what's the source of that dispute? It's a temple on the borders, and a disputed border, questioning where that line was drawn by the French imperialists a century or so ago. Many in the room are familiar with this. And then the final kind of 5-year point is that we are really contingent on what domestic politics in key countries brings us. This is especially the case in the great powers in the US, India, and China. What path does Xi Jinping's China take over the next 5 years? Does he remain in place? Does China revert to where it was before, a more moderate, cautious, technocratic leadership? Or does the assertive, abrasive, ambitious face that Xi Jinping brings to the world remain in place? Does the US break the fever dream of Trumpian realpolitik, or transactional realpolitik? It's hard to see American politics going back to the way it was. It's hard to see a kind of return to liberal internationalism, trade policy that those of us dependent on free markets appreciate. And India's Modi is the BJP's Hindu nationalism here to stay? Will it go when Modi goes? Will Congress return? We simply can't say. But the balance of probabilities is that the direction of travel that we've experienced over the past decade is likely to remain. And then, of course, what happens in the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, and Vietnam is also critical. So what does all this mean for you, strategic planners? I think I'd point to 3 things, and then I'll shut up. One, turbulence is here to stay. The global context is going to be one of, I think, roiling uncertainty. That's going to be the sort of settings. This is not going to be a year in which you go, gosh, we got through that, poof, back to normal. The COVID year, or years if you're in Melbourne, we look back on as an extraordinarily disruptive period, but the speed with which it kind of snapped back in many ways is remarkable. I don't think that's going to occur at the global stage, or sort of snap back to how things were in the early 2000s. And so what that means for planning is uncertainty, and managing this uncertainty needs to be dialed up very, very considerably. Secondly, I think organizations of all kinds need to put a high premium on flexibility. That's to say, establish settings within your institutions, within your organizations, in which you can adapt swiftly to changing circumstances, both big and small. Big things, this is an organization that's not principally economic, but as trade rules seem to change by the day, if you're a trading organization, you've got to be able to adapt to this quickly. The third thing is around nationalism. Nationalism is easily the most powerful and potent force in global politics, and it has been for several generations. The liberal era of the 90s, early 2000s, I think will be looked back on as this sort of brief period, generational period where it receded from view. And the lesson in both authoritarian and I think in domestic politics is that politics is downstream of culture, and nationalism and that sort of victimized nationalism are going to shape, and that interplay between culture and politics is going to be particularly, I think, febrile. Finally, economically, on the economic front, expect lower growth, expect inflation to stick around, and the possibility of that, if you thought the 70s, you thought flares were bad and sideburns were bad the first time, stagflation is going to be worse the second time round. What about AI? I hear you say, surely AI will solve the productivity. AI productivity may see this one off. I suspect we're already beginning to see the observation that was made with the third industrial revolution with computers in the 90s and early 2000s. The computer revolution can be seen everywhere except the productivity data. That's true so far with AI. With ChatGPT has been around for 3 years. Productivity gains from generative AI are basically zero so far, despite the fact that companies like OpenAI are burning hundreds of millions of dollars on it. I may be wrong, but I suspect at this point, the balance of probabilities is that the weight of economic nationalism is going to overburden the productivity gains of AI. All right, I'll stop there, Alex, so you don't have to beat me.
That is, we're all going to take deep breaths after that. Thank you so much for setting that scene and what it might mean for us. Thank you, Nick. Deep breath. Next speaker up is Seb Chan. Seb Chan is the director and CEO of ACME, the Australian Centre for Moving Image, based in Melbourne. And he's been guiding ACME as a museum focused on screen culture and the intersection of media, technology, world building, and storytelling. Prior to his appointment to this role, Seb was ACME's and the museum field's first Chief Experience Officer from 2015 to 2022, and was a key part of the team behind ACME's expansion into a multi-award-winning, multi-platform museum. Prior to his time with ACME, Seb led the digital transformation of the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York, from its award-winning interactive pen with local projects to the acquisition of important software-based works for the Smithsonian collection. And that was from 2011 to 2015. Seb is a current national president of the Australian Museums and Galleries Association, AMAGA. He serves on the International Advisory Board of Art Science Museum Singapore and is a board member of the non-profit Tessitura Network in the US. Seb is adjunct professor, School of Media and Communication in the College of Design and Social Context at the RMIT. He's an alumnus of the Getty. He's an alumnus of the Getty Leadership Institute, Salzburg Global Seminar, UN New South Wales, and was awarded the University of New South Wales Alumni Award for Art and Culture in 2024. Congrats, Seb. Seb's going to speak on culture, museums, the digital, and all sorts of wonderful things. Thank you very much, Seb.
Thanks heaps, Alex. Hopefully you can see my screen. Nick, that was terrifying, and I was feeling a little bit like this, which is what's on the screen now. I feel like we all feel a little bit like this now. I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country in Nam. I pay my respects to elders past to present, and to any other First Nations people on this call. So Nick's given a really big picture thing that's kind of terrified me. But also, so I'm going sort of really zooming in. Alex and Vinod and the crew asked me to talk a bit about museums and tech and some of the big changes that we're going through. So, yeah, let's kick off. So I guess for me, I think back to a designer and artist friend of mine, Anab Jain from Superflux, and as Nick was saying, sometimes it feels like we're in this turbulent period. And Anab coined more than 10 years ago. She felt in 2014 we were in this period as what she called it, protracted superdensity, dystopia and chaos all at once. And I would note that was 2014, not 2016, not 2021. So interesting times. And yes, and working in the museum and cultural sector for a long time, we are not immune to this. We are buffeted by it, but we also have the responsibility to collect it, to preserve artifacts from it, and to help make it make sense, I guess, for our communities that we represent and are part of. So It's also occurring at a time when we know that there's low trust in institutions. So this comes out across lots and lots of studies and surveys across the world. Australia is not exempt from this. I would also say that this has been, it could be argued that this has been a particular set of political actions that have occurred across the last 40 years that have reduced trust in institutions, and that reduced trust also applies to museums, galleries, libraries, archives. And you can see some of what's going on in the US now, where museums and archives specifically are being attacked in direct political ways. However, the other thing that's going on and with regard to technology is the Edelman Trust Barometer has been running for a long time, and I always use this slide to show, one of the challenges that institutions also face is society is feeling that technology is moving too fast, and our society is changing too quickly, and these things are kind of accelerating each other. So when I think about running a museum that is a museum, the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, which is a museum of media, and also media is technology stories. It is driven by technology. Changes in media are technological and social change too. I am right at the heart of a museum that is about the very things that people are fearing. So anyway, this is some good context, I guess. So I think there's a strong responsibility within the museum sector to acknowledge this when we think about how we might engage with the present and how we might take that present through to a future and perhaps a series of pluralistic futures, and help our communities imagine alternatives to one where I think we feel we're doom scrolling and have less agency than perhaps we actually do have. So the meta question, I guess, for museums and galleries, particularly also when I'm speaking to artists, is do institutions work to rebuild institutional trust? Or is it time to build new institutions of a new sort and a new type, perhaps to deliver variants of the mission and a purpose we've had? Are our institutions as we have them, in quotes, fit for purpose, or do we need new things altogether? And it sort of oscillates between rebuild versus new. And I think this is a tension that plays out that actually is getting in the way of us actually moving on things. I think organizations need to find ways to not get paralyzed by this, what is sometimes presented as a binary choice. Obviously, I've been talking about my museum being a museum of kind of media. I would now suggest that all museums are media, and that brings new complexities to our work. This is not a new thing. I would say that way back when I started my museum career, and museums were still trying to figure out what this new thing, the internet, was all about, and websites and all of these things, and then social media, and then mobile. Museums were already becoming media then. And I will often still speak to museum people and people at large is, look, if people would just read the story, if people would just read the labels in museums, if people would just watch the video we made, if people would just get kind of the facts, the world would be a better place. And of course, emotions very much get in the drive these things. Facts are not necessarily what motivates action, however much we want them to. So I think a lot of the work now, a lot of the opportunity in the work now in our sector is about rebuilding muscles around setting context and creating comfortable environments for people to encounter each other and to get out of the noise of the world in order to engage in new forms of sociality and social action, to take action. So coming from this place where institutions need to put more effort into context creation, sort of paradoxically, the more access to information we get, the less ability to develop and discern context seems to happen. So we've seen that in politics with the flooding, kind of the zone methods of some political factions, through to now, the end kind of less shared lack of consensus. So there's no single points of reference anymore. So again, museums, galleries, archives, libraries too have a great opportunity in helping our communities slow down and restore focus. And I think this really matters. And I think restoring focus and building up those muscles to allow people to engage with complexity, to engage with competing facts, competing narratives and stories, to pause and become reflective rather than reactive. These are things that we can no longer take as a given. We need to consider and design for those things. This comes down to, like, when we deploy technologies that we might see as incredibly normalized in society now. It's very hard to imagine being on a train or a tram or a bus without wearing your AirPods. When we bring those tools, what our visitors, our customers, our users might desire to use and might be socially normalized, these have collective effects. And so I think it's important that museum professionals consider this, as we are spaces of media, and we have spaces where we have some intent that we want to do, some intent about the kind of world we want to shape. We need to realize that sometimes going with things that are normalized, like AirPods, audio tours, these sorts of things, do have these downstream potential political and social effects. None of this is new, but it feels like the urgency of considering these things is heightened. Of course, museums, galleries, they're multi-sensorial spaces. There's a great opportunity to draw on the multi-sensorialness of physical objects, smell, sound, things that draw us away from the flatness of our screens and the flatness of our personalized media worlds. Disrupted is kind of a overused word, but we think about in the museum world of the last 20 years, smartphones arriving between 2008 and 2010, artificial so-called intelligence as well now. These are waves that will continue to roll over our sector and field, and it feels we are sometimes ill-equipped to realize that these things will continue to come. Of course, trust, when we think about trusted institutions, trust is, of course, relational, and this is something that needs to be continuously worked on. And as I said, all technology decisions that are made within institutions have social and cultural dimensions. So I think it's really important to be thinking about, when you're running a museum or running a space where you expect people to spend time, that you value people's time and you value the time that's needed for people to engage and make sense of the works that we show. I think that's one of the other challenges in the field, as the museum and gallery space faces more, let's say, corporatizing pressures and the ideologies of and comparisons with other environments. For example, retail environments is, as we are encouraged to move down a more transactional path and measure our social benefits in transactional terms, we often don't think about the importance of valuing the time that people spend with us. Time matters. Time allows people, as I said, to slow down and to engage with complexity. And it takes time for people to feel comfortable, particularly post-pandemic, of being with other people. So rebuilding sociality requires time. Okay. Obviously, other thing that's going on that's coming out of technology and media culture and the digitization and the digitalization of our culture is, if you are a museum that has been about things, physical things, you are inevitably becoming a museum that is less about things. So the obvious example is those fabulous photo collections of the 20th century, that if once you get to the arrival of the smartphone, most photography, amateur and professional, is digital, and so there is no thing to collect anymore, and those things are now artifacts that are digital items, born kind of digital, covered usually by a series of complex rites, now increasingly hosted and held in server farms and as part of services. So the need to build new methods to engage with a digitalized culture also matters a lot. These are also increasingly resistant to traditional modes of exhibition. I've just come from opening an exhibition about video games, and those video games are born digital, but it's fascinating to see the engagement that people have around seeing the materials of creation and the tools of creation. And in some cases, the memories triggered by the physical items, the old 1990s computer monitors, for example, that reminds people of playing in a LAN party in their teens or 20s. Shannon Merton, a really amazing digital humanities scholar, says what forms of cultural memory do not fit on library shelves or city servers. These are not new challenges, but as we've seen, there's a lot. Where are the museums of dance, museums of sport? Where are the museums of shadows, wind, and rust? Museums are also relational. The key challenges I see for us in the future as we move to a more technology and digital reliant institutional sector are questions of maintenance, human labor, the new skills and literacies we will need to maintain and work in these fields, and of course the energy transition realities, the energy costs, and then the climate impacts as well. That is the end of my session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Seb. Thanks very much. All right. Yes, so much to think about there. I'm looking forward to the question time. Our next presentation is by Dr. Kathy Daly, and she pre-recorded this for us, and she's based in the UK, but she is here and will be available to answer questions afterwards. So Kathy is Senior Lecturer in Heritage Conservation at the University of Lincoln in the UK, and Senior Researcher at Carrig Conservation International Limited, based in Ireland. Kathy's research and consultancy work focuses on climate change and cultural heritage, including climate risk assessments, monitoring impacts, and adaptation planning. She was lead researcher and author of Ireland's first climate change sectoral adaptation plan for built and archaeological heritage in 2019, and for the new plan due for adoption in October this year. She's a member of the ICOMOS International Working Group on Climate Action and was a lead author on the Future of Our Past's ICOMOS report in 2019 and the ICOMOS Climate Adaptation Toolkit 2022, published in 5 languages. She's also a research coordinator for cultural heritage in 23-24 for the Climate Action Toolkit for World Heritage, an international project led by ICOMOS, ICCROM, IUCN and UNESCO World Heritage Centre, which was funded by the Australian and Norwegian governments. Hooray for us. Kathy will speak to a new integrated way of cultural heritage management, Climate Smart. Thank you.
Towards a climate smart cultural heritage management. So today I'm going to be talking about climate change and climate action. I'm not going to go into climate change too much, but just to say, as we can see from this graphic, we are in a period of climate change, and we are in what we would call a climate emergency. So we therefore need to take climate action, and cultural heritage can't be left out of this society-wide and global challenge. Climate action is generally composed of two activities. The first is mitigation, by which I mean addressing the causes of climate change. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions in line with Paris Agreement targets, transitioning and transforming, and that word, we'll come back to it, transforming towards a low carbon future. But there's a degree of warming, as we saw from the climate stripes, already built into the system. So we need to adapt as well to the ongoing impacts of climate change. And for cultural heritage, that means understanding climate risk and understanding how we can respond in order to minimize the negative consequences, and perhaps if there are any positive consequences, to take advantage of those. But I've put that scales there because we also need to do all of this through a climate justice lens, because as we know, the poorest communities and those in developing countries are the worst affected, although they've contributed the least to the problem. So transition and transformation and adaptation needs to be done in a just and fair way that doesn't leave anyone behind. I would say that the majority of research in terms of cultural heritage and climate action has probably focused on understanding risks and impacts. So I'm not going to go into those too much, but just to say, first off, there are the direct risks. Those can be those catastrophic, very visible effects that are quite sudden, and the slower cumulative effects that are less visible, but possibly more widespread, and I like to conceptualize those as the tortoise and the hare. There's also the indirect effects. This is about how the human part of the system will react to climate change, both through mitigation actions to reduce greenhouse gases and adaptation actions to respond to the impacts of climate change. And where these don't consider cultural heritage values, they can also be damaging. Now, modern conservation practice and heritage management is all about managing change. And of course, the Australian Borough Charter was very central to developing these concepts. But as Melnick wrote in 2009, given the potential effects of rapid global climate change, the sector may need to develop a new understanding of what managing change means. He said that there were three possible approaches. One was to resist the change, which is unsustainable in most cases. Second was the ideal scenario where you can enhance the system's capacity to cope with the change. The third is the one that's most challenging for cultural heritage, and that is transforming the system to a new state which is more compatible with the changed climate. But the question there for finite non-renewable cultural heritage resources is, when does adaptive change equate to loss of value, including thinking about issues like integrity and authenticity? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, defines adaptation actions as the array of strategies and measures that are available and appropriate to address adaptation. They include a wide range of actions that can be categorized as, say, hard engineering, institutional measures such as policy change, ecological or nature-based solutions, or behavioral. So changing the way we do things, capacity building, training, that kind of thing. There's a tension in cultural heritage, which I mentioned already, between the level of intervention and some of those key concepts around protecting value. And it's that tension which makes this idea of transformative change slightly trickier for cultural heritage resources. However, I would point out that transformative change is actually talked about in the 2023 UNESCO policy document on climate action for World Heritage. So that concept is already there. And that document says that transformative change would be exemplified by decisions that contribute towards making World Heritage sites carbon neutral, more resilient, and better adapted to a changing climate, while safeguarding their outstanding universal value. So there's still that idea of trying to balance climate action with protecting values, but also it says that properties can embrace transformative change to become demonstration cases of the change the world needs. And there's that idea that cultural heritage actually has something to contribute to society through addressing climate change and through climate action and transformative change. So it's seeing cultural heritage management as part of climate action and society's transition and transformation. Now, that's great, but the UNESCO system and cultural heritage management systems around the world were not set up with that as their baseline, and many of the barriers to being more flexible and more transformative are in fact some of the divisions that we have made in order to help management and policy of cultural heritage. So already within the sector, there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of attention to the false dichotomies between cultural nature, between tangible and intangible, but we need to address these as a matter of urgency because they are potential barriers to adaptation and transformative change for heritage. So in the article, we write that addressing the growing anthropogenic climate change risks and impacts requires a fundamental rethink and transformation of cultural heritage management and policy. Therefore, a transition toward fundamentally new or different systems of governance, institutions, policies, priorities, values, behaviors, including plural knowledge, is required. And we are doing a lot of this. I've touched on a few issues already that are already out there, and plural knowledge is another one where we're already doing it, but it needs to be ramped up. So the Paris Agreement states on Article 7 that adaptation action should be based on and guided by the best available science and traditional knowledge, knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems. So that's cultural heritage, and we already do embrace that in preparing for loss is another issue that comes up a lot in relation to climate change and cultural heritage. And again, it's something that we do, but the way that we view that is around perhaps trying to preserve the cultural heritage values for and of themselves, whereas I think actually the importance of this for society, for social cohesion, in a very rapidly changing world can't be overlooked. And this was brought home to me when I did this project with Carrick on historic coastal graveyards, where the community survey was full of quotes that made me realize how very, very important these places are to people. And it's not an academic exercise when we can facilitate their transition to whatever future is in front of them. And I know that there's many people from the Pacific here who are way ahead of us on this. But for me, this was my kind of Rubicon where I realized that, this is actually an extremely important role for cultural heritage in the climate emergency, is helping people to cope with loss and to take something with them through this transition. It may not be the tangible remains, but there is the intangible clue. Another issue is communication and engagement. And we did this survey of visitors to heritage places as part of a report for the Government of Ireland in 2023. And what we found was that only 14% of visitors to heritage sites in Ireland learned something about climate change from their visit. but 72% said that they would like to learn more about climate change and cultural heritage. So again, another role for cultural heritage in climate action that we're not yet fully embracing, at least in Ireland, we're not. So in our article, we state that an important starting point for more transformative action is to transform decision makers, stakeholders, and communities involved in heritage management from objects in need of change to agents of change. And that's about viewing themselves as capable of contributing to systematic transformations. So seeing how cultural heritage contributes to wider change as well is a very important part of this transformation that we want. But of course, while we all might say we want change, actually changing can be quite painful and quite difficult. And I think we need to be critical as well of our own sector and of how we do things. So it's not about just focusing on addressing climate change as a challenge that we need to address in the sector, but on how our own culture, beliefs, values, and behaviors influence the arrangements and the policies and the decision-making practices and processes that can both contribute to the problem in the first place, but can also address them on a more societal scale. Sorry, jump that slide. So this then is the conceptual framework for climate smart cultural heritage. And you can see that the idea here is that we have the mitigation of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, addressing the root causes of climate change, adapting to increase resilience against climate change, and that climate justice, human security, sustainable development for communities and people. And all three things come together and underpin the climate smart cultural heritage approach, which means that climate change is not something that you see as being tacked on to what you do, but it's actually fundamental to what you do. And everything is through that lens, so that all of your cultural heritage management actions are actually contributing in a positive way to making the world a better place, to be that ambitious about it, but through that climate change lens, and seeing cultural heritage as part of societal progress on that matter. So it's the CSCH challenge then is placing equal importance on addressing social and climate justice, including just transition when applying the approach. And perhaps the key starting point, we say in the article, for transformation is the recognition that cultural heritage management can no longer be isolated from other societal challenges. I think that's really important to emphasize. It should embrace a vision in which cultural heritage is a vector for positive transformation within society and for the benefit of future generations. So how can we do that? I mean, I think I pointed to some things already that we're already touching on. I think we need to, first of all, really recognize the broad role of heritage in climate action and be critical of the limitations of the current systems that we use. We need to valorize and really in a meaningful way, diverse knowledge sources. And that includes cross-sectoral working, the inclusion of communities and multidisciplinary approaches. We need to find ways to address future discounting, political and financial instability. And we need to engage with this idea that loss can be viewed as transformative or an evolving process rather than an end process. So I just thought I'd end with this sort of slightly challenging quote from Caitlin Southwick, who says that professionals maintain the status quo and don't question or cause disturbance. I don't know if you would recognize that as yourself, as a professional. But she goes on to say, which I would agree with, the climate conversation requires questions. It requires challenging current practices, and it may be seen as a disturbance. So what I would like is that cultural heritage becomes a facilitator for societal change, not a gatekeeper for cultural heritage resources. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to questions.
I love that. And I was so thrilled when I came across your article and Sandra's article, and thank you so much. And I'll start the question with you being very positive, but I love your transformational focus, and a perennial tension is in culture is that tension between the intrinsic value of heritage and the instrumental value. It's always that tension that's held out for us. Where does climate smart actually cultural heritage management sit? Is this a mythical third way that we somehow seem to actually be landing between the intrinsic adherents and the instrumental advocates?
Maybe a third way is a way of looking at it. I hadn't really thought about that. I think I brought up the climate action policy that UNESCO adopted for World Heritage because it does talk about transformational change in there, but it doesn't, it's sort of not fudge the issue, but it doesn't really give a clear way of dealing with this problem. And I think that is a core issue at the moment. Certainly, I mean, speaking from the Irish perspective, you know, we have these systems in place which create these barriers between different types of heritage and very, you know, hard won protections for heritage, which people don't, you know, within the system obviously don't want to weaken, or because they're worried about the consequences. But I mean, obviously we're in a time, and your previous speaker, Nick, was very clear about the kind of, you know, time of flux that we're in. So we do need to do things differently. And it's, you know, how do you sort of not throw out the baby with the bathwater? It's a question that's bigger than I can answer, but I think we need to start with this willingness to actually look critically at how we do things and where we can embrace change, and working in a cross-sectoral way, I think, is really enriching. And we've done that through the adaptation plan as well, and you can see a lot of benefits from that, which kind of counteract some of the maybe losses that we might get by being a bit more flexible and giving and accepting a bit more change. So I don't have an answer, but what I would encourage is it's one that we need to all build together. So yeah, let's open the conversation, and I think the new generation coming through are probably a lot more flexible and adaptable than the ones that have been here for a while and are kind of clinging on to the, as I said, the hard won protections for heritage.
Thank you. Please put your questions in the questions, and I do have one here, but I'm just going to jump to Seb next. Seb, people talk about the attention economy, and it seems that you're actually talking about the role of cultural places, museums and galleries in particular, as actually providing that space. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's a super important thing that we often don't see, that we are part of that, and we are an antidote potentially to it. I don't know if it's, I don't like to think of it as attention being what people lack. It's actually the ability to focus that people lack. So I think as I think about how media ecologies and media economies and media platforms are designed now, when you're producing, say, sports broadcasting, the high focus on delivering content that is engaged with in the way consumers behave, means that sports broadcasting is now designed for you to have a second or perhaps a third screen running in the room at the same time. Now, when museums and galleries copy those what are becoming cultural norms, they forget that they don't operate in those economic structures. We don't. Museums don't gain from chasing clicks. We don't gain from internet advertising unless we change our revenue models. All these things. So we often, when we're designing how we deliver and present content. We borrow from adjacent fields, but we're not borrowing from adjacent fields necessarily with the full perspective of why those adjacent fields work the way they work. And I think that's been something, you know, someone who's been involved in putting museums on the internet and all that for 25 years. I'm very conscious of that now. That's just one example, but I do think there's a strong swing back particularly for younger generations to be visiting museums and galleries now, and they, to be honest, whenever we survey them, they always say we want less screens. We are actually coming in. I mean, I run cinemas too, and it's fascinating to speak to some of our young people who are coming into the cinemas, are actually telling us they want to come and see a film in our cinemas because they will be told to put their phone away.
Yeah.
They watch it at home.
Yeah.
That they won't put it away, right? So I think there's something interesting there. It's kind of a superpower that museums as a convening space has, and we should be using that to open up the dialogues that will perhaps get us to some of those things that Kathy's been talking about. Is that we need spaces, and museums and galleries have an opportunity to step into that space. I think the public, particularly the public, is interested in that, certainly within Australia. But the financial structures and governance models that support museums and galleries sometimes find that hard to work with. So.
I think you've almost answered one of the questions we have online, but if you just want to add to that. So the question from Michael Chisnell is social media and online news feeds preference and immediacy of opinion, which diminishes the role of the past. How do museums and galleries respond to this?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, as someone who was, you know, one of the early adopters of social media in museums, training people on this stuff and other things, I don't think certainly social media in 2025 is very different to social media in 2015 and certainly in the early years of 2008. And I think the way that you know, museums and galleries, you know, I think sometimes were chasing things for at one point very good reasons, and then the operating environments of the things they were chasing changed, i.e. social media platforms, and the platformization of media and media economies, and museums kept chasing them and got drawn into some of the worst tendencies, which I don't think has served our sector well. I think there's a tension between chasing relevance and asserting what's important about difference and what makes museums special. And I see this the same with, you know, in the digitization of museum collections, you know, over the past 25 years too, and the ebbs and flows between standardization. So, you know, museum collections becoming searchable across many museums because we do things the same way, one end, and the other end, understanding that individual museums do things differently, and that's part of what makes them
The rich tapestry of museum world, yes.
Nuanced, responsive to their locality and specificities of their community. So this sort of tension between sort of hyper localization and globalization sort of plays out in many ways. And I think you know, I think it's important for the field to develop muscles around that. That's sort of what I was getting at with my maintenance comment was, you know, it's important that there are a changing set of skills that our sector needs in-house and a changing set of skills that we work with others on as our field shifts. And I think we'll see that with climate.
Talking about as well. Yeah. Can I just think, Nick, we're talking about social media, and I'm looking at your catalogue of challenges and that's happening in the region. Would it be that we're just more exposed through social media to what's going on, or how or is it really as bad as you're being outlining? Or is it a combination of the two?
I mean, it's definitely both, and the the awareness of risk is and challenges, and the immediacy with which you experience things heightens that sense of the dramatic, I think. But I could bore you senseless with data around defense expenditure across the region over 10 or 15 years, about the acquisition of offensive warfighting capabilities. I have this joke that the Asia across the board increased defense expenditure by something like net 20-25% over the past 10 years. And it's not on pension plans and golf courses, it's on attack submarines, next fifth generation fighter aircraft, that sort of stuff. And it's true also with, as I was sort of sketching out, with the incidents between Taiwan. The same can be said over incidents in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. The friction is real on that front. I think the political instability is very real, and I think even, I mean, to add a sort of micro point on social media, it also makes managing these things harder. So the East and South China Sea interactions. So East China Sea, there's a dispute between Japan and China about these islands. The Japanese call the Senkaku, the Chinese call it Diaoyu, and that's been going on for a long time. I mean, generations. It was Imperial Japan seized them. I mean, long story as to their origins, very murky, as to whose claim is quote unquote right. And they've been bumping into each other for at least 15 years or more. But it would take days for that to roll out, even in 2010. So 2010 was this sort of kind of turning point where there was an incident. But it took kind of days for us to be aware of it. Now, if something happens, it's almost instantaneous, and you can watch the videos almost in real time. And so and there's both the reality of it, and there's the manufactured fear of it, which is adding to the complexity. So it's sort of I think you're right in that there's a greater awareness of it, but it sort of itself is putting the temperature up and making the management of these things that much more complex. I guess if I could just give myself an excuse, not an excuse, but to be clear, I'm not a counsel of complete doom. What I'm trying to say is, what we have is a really, really complex environment, and you're right to think it's complex, and not like I'm losing a sense of proportion. And it's not just because of social media, but the sort of optimistic point is it doesn't have to be. And there are ways in which this can be managed. There are ways in which things can be walked back. There are ways in which the risk can be dialed down. And the important point is, as Seb said it and Kathy also said, we have to think about how to do that. We have to activate it. We have to take steps that are both local, put pressure on political leaders, and make them recognize that there are changes. And one thing I often tell people who aren't familiar with Chinese politics is that there's a tendency outside of China, particularly for people who are not obsessive compulsive kind of China watchers, to assume that the China you have right now is the China that will always be with us. And that led to complacency in the 90s and early 2000s, because you had a kind of meritocratic, technocratic leadership that was cautious internationally. They didn't want to take risks. They didn't want to offend people. And we assumed that was what we were always going to get. So when Xi Jinping arrived, we all sort of assumed he was going to be cut from that cloth. And of course, he's not. He's a very different authoritarian, very not quite cult of personality, but heading that direction. But he's a creature of the party, and the party could change his mind. And the party created Xi, created Hu Jintao. And so in that possibility, we've got to remember that as things are, they don't always remain. And that's probably the slight glimmer of hope in all of this.
Well, thank you. And I must say, a little plug for historians. As a historian, we know that things have not always been the way they have been. We know that things can change. So study history, everyone. Doesn't matter how much.
Enroll in a history degree. At La Trobe, even better.
Everyone do a history degree. Thank you so much. Now, there was a question asking Kathy for some case studies. I think, Kathy, we might sort of come back to that later, because I really do want to move on to the next session. Thank you very much, all three of you. And I think the critical thing is we need to know what we're facing. We need to know the challenges, and then be of great heart to actually tackle them. Our next session, session 2, is changing practices in strategic planning. And there are 3 panelists, and each will speak for 10 minutes, after which we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. And please, again, put your questions in the Q&A box. First up is Ms. Vijaya Amujuru. Vijaya is a conservation architect based in India with an experience of about 22 years in the field of heritage conservation. After completing her Bachelor of Architecture degree, she went on to study a Master of Science in Historic Building Conservation from the University of Bath in the UK. During the span of 2 decades of her career, she's worked on thousands of historic buildings and monuments in the country and led several prestigious conservation projects in India, including the President's Estate. She has contributed to several publications, is a recipient of the prestigious UNESCO Asia-Pacific Award 2017 for the conservation of Gohad Fort in Madhya Pradesh. She is also a recipient of the Sawai Jaipur Award 2024 for her contribution to architectural heritage. She's currently the Principal Director of the Architectural Heritage Division of INTAC, which is the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage and a long-standing MOU partner of AusHeritage. And she strives towards setting up good practices in conservation works, working directly with skilled masons, continuing the traditional craft, preparing a schedule of rates for conservation work, and listing and documentation of the unprotected heritage of India. Vijaya will speak about the pressures and practice and how INTAC is changing.
Thank you so much. I'm extremely privileged to be part of the symposium this morning. I will speak about conservation practices in India. I know the time is very short, so I'll focus it to the changing practices. So just to give an overview, very quick overview, the total number of World Heritage sites is 44, 36 cultural sites, 7 natural, and 1 mixed. The first one being, the Taj Mahal and the Ellora forts in Maharashtra in 1983. And, we also have the serial nomination of hill forts of Rajasthan, and the recent one being the Maratha forts in 2025. So all of them are, they come under the maintenance and management of Archaeological Survey of India, mostly except very few, for example, the Le Corbusier buildings in Chandigarh or the Ahmedabad and the Jaipur walled cities, where the local administration is responsible for the overall management. So the Archaeological Survey of India, protects about 3,698 monuments and sites in the country. The typology is quite, diverse, like the archaeological remains, sites, mounds, forts and palaces, temples, mosques, monoliths, megaliths, dolmens. However, 98 is a very, 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 very small number for such a large country, like ours, with 5,000, 6,000-year-old history and civilization. And apart from the ASI, there is also the State Department of Archaeology, where they protect about 7,794 monuments. 4,096. So together they become less than 8,000, which is 7,794. So it is quite such a small number, because there are so many hundreds of thousands of heritage buildings which fall outside the purview of the government protection, and they constitute the living heritage. And given the large geopolitical expansion of our country, the number can go up to, I think, 400,000 or 500,000 or much more. So conserving the living heritage that exists in the myriad forms offers the potential to conserve both the traditional buildings and the traditional way of buildings. So these are, this powerhouse of traditional knowledge. So even to deal with, I think, issues like the climate change, and this knowledge was transferred, through generation and was part of their daily lives. They didn't have to learn it, especially. So if you see the changing, scenario, or, the recent legislation, especially for the ASI protected monuments, so which was the, based on the Act of 1958, the AMSAR Act, Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains Act, which had an amendment in 2010, and which delineated this protected area and the prohibited area and the regulated area, which is 100-meter and the further 200-meter from the notified zone. And it also established a National Monument Authority to manage these, the construction and the development around in these areas. So this amendment brought in some desirable, fair regulations, especially to control the construction, around the monument. However, there are several limitations, such as the immediate surrounding of these monuments are actually living cities. They are not open spaces. So, and they are part of, the monument itself. So to have a blanket prohibition, doesn't really work. And also the act imposes regulation in 300 meters, but the visual linkages are not taken care of, like this, like the first sun ray come, to a temple Gopuram. And what if, a construction in a 1 kilometer or 2 kilometer actually, blocks that space, something that has already happened in a beautiful monument in Sarkhes Rosa in Ahmedabad, which where the sunset was very, very popular and people used to actually come to witness the sunset, and there is a lake, a beautiful large lake. Of course, the lake is now dry. And also the sun is blocked by a tall building, constructed just, I think, 500 or 600 meter from the monument. So these are, very important aspects that need attentions by the government. And well, ASI is now open to, new ideas to incorporate, to corporate partnerships, the CSR fundings, and well, the states have also opened up to public-private partnerships and lease the properties to agencies for a longer years, to manage the properties. Well, this is, the Miss India context. The participants were taken to this 800-year-old Ramappa Temple, a World Heritage Site, which was nominated in 2021. And it hosted a very special cultural event on 14th May 2025. And this was, we did not expect this a few years ago from ASI. So these are some welcoming, changes to bring, to highlight the heritage of our India. So if you see now the unprotected category of heritage buildings, again, there are, several typologies, from the residence to, the religious, to the institutions, to the streets, to the market squares, to the, small, riverfront, to the industrial heritage. I think, there are so many, the list is endless. Well, I'll run through, some slides just to show. These are some traditional Havelis or the houses in Ahmedabad, in Rajasthan. You can see these giant, very large Jain sculptures, statues. These are some of the buildings in Jammu and Kashmir, some buildings going away to road widening, some to property divisions, some to very incompatible construction immediately after some earthquake. The right side building shows, the division of the property by two brothers. One is willing to keep it, one is willing to reconstruct in a very, very, very inappropriate way. So, but all these first need to be documented, registered, and recognized as heritage. And that is one of the biggest challenge that we have. As we lose them very rapidly, we don't have a registered of it at one place. So who is going to do it? INTAC, when it was established in 1984, one of the very important mandates was to list down all these heritage buildings. But I mean, the number is so incredible that, till today, only 100,000 of these heritage buildings have been listed, and it's a long way to go. And of course, we have, these inventory systems, and, which is very, very standard. And we have also opened up to the public, the database is open to the website, so anybody can see it and use it. And also we have prepared some very easily downloaded, mobile apps, which, anyone, I mean, for crowdsourcing, anyone can actually upload into our database, because this needs to be popularized, and one institution, group of institutions will not be able to do it alone. At the same time, we have also, come across some fantastic individual efforts, like this stepwell.org, which has listed about 3,287 stepwells in India. Marvelous. So there is another one only in the state of Maharashtra. Again, it is an individual effort, and he has listed about 2,000 in one state. So these numbers are just unbelievable, and it also shows that how a people's movement is required at this time. And so just to scan through some of the stepwells, you can see marvelous structures. Maybe different kinds, circular, tank like stepped structures. So amazingly beautiful, but you can see that there is no water in it. The water, the drastic reduced level of water table, combined with the mass construction and disconnect between the stepwells, because if in one town itself, I think there used to be a couple of 10, 20, 30 stepwells, and now they are reduced to only monuments, only not only monuments, but as you can see that they are quite neglected. And this temple tank on the right side top screen is from Madurai. So I think it is a rainy season, otherwise this water also we can't see. So, and even now the villagers, this is especially from Rajasthan, because there is so much water scarcity that people still rely on some of these water heritage structures, or the stepwells, or the bowdis we talk. Then since we are talking about these incredible numbers of heritage in India, we also have 3,000 historic cities. Some are amazingly beautiful, climatic resilient, packed with traditional knowledge and wisdom, like this Shekhawati region, where of Rajasthan, where we find about 2,000 residences, and the Sidhpur in Gujarat, or there are innumerable towns in southern of India. So of course, in terms of funding, to have, to aid, to assist in the restoration, there are so many schemes now by the government of India, like the Hriday or Prashad or Amrit or Swadesh. There are smart city missions, but there are so many challenges. I think there is, especially in case of buildings under the private ownership, there is a lack of policy. And there is always a debate between heritage buildings and model buildings, which is completely, I think, it's a non-issue, and heritage as non-priority in planning and all that. And the limited technical conservation expertise is also a problem, but not as much, like it was in 10 years ago, because with 10 institutions now offering, master's program in conservation, the number of professionals has steadily increased. And the principles and practices, we need to promote minimum intervention, rather than the beautification concept, which is like a trend in presently. But yes, the main problem is a neglect. Neglect, not integrating them, this heritage, the heritage assets in the development, not recognizing their existence, is the biggest challenge, than any climate change or natural calamities. So just maintaining them well and continuing the use of the heritage building, repurposing them in the best is the best that we can contribute, to contribute to the Mother Earth, I would say. So, and the traditional buildings, they encompass sustainable material use, understanding of nature, climate resilient construction technique, including comfortable and livable spaces, and they have a very, very low environmental impact. I don't think I need to explain all that. So I'll just show you, one of the very recently completed project. There was a lot of dispute over it, whether they should build a new museum, by demolishing some old structure. But we insisted that, there is a lot of potential in the old building itself, and it can be very, very easily adapted, to have a tribal freedom fighter museum in a very small place in one of the corners in the central part of India. So you can see the before and after. So there were galleries made inside. Inside this building, 6 galleries, and now it is very, very popular. And we have handed over to the community, and they are, you know, running the show in the museum. I mean, it's not a museum, it's more of a, you know, a virtual experiential center, you can say. So when we talk about the monument, I will, you know, just end with this case study. So these are, you know, the terracotta temples of West Bengal. Again, there would be about, you know, so many thousand of terracotta temples in one of the states, which is West Bengal. You can see how lovely they are, but, you know, over the years, they have been abandoned, they've been neglected. The idols have been taken out, you know, from the shrine, from the sanctum, and so the worship has been, you know, stopped. And how you see that, you know, they're completely overgrown with trees and vegetations. So we adopted a bottom-up approach, you know, with the community actually doing the work, and then after that we intervene in the restoration, because it was not a very simple, you know, even the practice of this terracotta plaques is also endangered. I mean, they don't practice it anymore. So the community then, I mean, these are the villagers who cleaned it, and now we can see, you know, the temples very, very clearly. And the worship has also now resumed, you know. And so we have done about 4 to 5 temples in 1 year, and we would like to, you know, do more. And so it's a long way and a long-term intervention and engagement.
What a rich cultural estate that you have there, and what so many challenges. Thank you. Our next speaker is Sarah Fayen, and Sarah is Director of Art Lab Australia, and she's a recognised leader, and the lab is a recognised leader in the conservation of cultural collections, providing quality service nationally and internationally. Art Lab's primary role is the preservation, care and management of South Australia's major cultural collections, working in partnership with the Art Gallery of South Australia, the South Australian Museum, State Library, History Trust and Carrick Hill. Prior to this, Sarah held numerous roles reliant on strategy, partnership and the delivery of high-value outcomes for community. And her experience includes the CEO Guildhouse, South Australia's peak body for visual artists, craftspeople and designers, acting manager, Creative City and team leader, Arts and Culture at the City of Adelaide, group manager, Collections at the State Library of South Australia, and principal advisor, Arts South Australia. She is a fellow of Governors Leadership Foundation. Sarah will speak both as a head of a cultural agency and as a professional materials conservator, and about what to do in terms of what has changed in terms of strategic planning and how she's navigating. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm delighted to be joining this conversation today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and pay my respects for their care and resilience in the keeping of culture. I'm very proud to work, live and create on Kaurna country. I'm coming from South Australia today. So you heard a little bit about Art Lab there. So we're a consolidated conservation of cultural collections service. We're celebrating our 40th year of anniversary this year. Our key services include preventive conservation, collection management, disaster preparedness, planning and response for collections, training and remedial conservation treatment. Our broad structure allows us to be partners and shared stewards for a great range of extensive and diverse collections, those that are held in collecting institutions as well as those in community and corporate hands. This diversity provides us the advantage of a wide purview across the sector. In all instances, our current drivers are the need to sustain the long-term physical durability and the intellectual integrity of collections while enhancing public access. So as exhibitions, public programming, restitution practices and research increases in quantity and it becomes more innovative, so too is the need for flexibility and adaptation in the conservation management approach. What we're seeing in terms of working with the custodians of our larger scale museums and galleries is that, as Seb has been talking about, the core mission remains the same: to research, to collect, to conserve, to interpret, to exhibit. But the collections are now so much more than a static resource. The priorities are increased. The core priority is about new ways of engagement with community. And this often and really excitingly includes participation in the strategic decision-making activity. And alongside that, we've heard there's a lot of investment being made in technology to support storytelling. So in practice, collections are growing, collections are changing, and the physical still matters. It's still highly valued. There are a whole lot of new materials, and we're working with the challenges of how we care for performative and intangible collections and born digital. What we're really seeing is collections are on the move, quite literally. Lots and lots of loans, lots of transport, lots of, which means they're vulnerable in those circumstances. Storage infrastructure isn't being funded to the extent that it's required, and disasters are regular and the frequency is on the increase. From an ArtLab perspective, we're seeing significant water inundation issues, principally from storms, sometimes from floods, and oh, so many insect infestations. Doesn't matter where those collections are held. So collection managers and conservators are so busy doing what they can within the current resources that the challenge is finding the time to reflect, focus on strategic planning, and then importantly, to put it into action. In response to this, some of the reflections about current strategic emphasis, particularly for ArtLab as a partner providing conservation service for collections, are number one, relationship building and collaboration. We're making significant effort to build alliances to get the work done. We work in genuine partnership and we take a strength-based approach where we're wanting to combine skills, systems, and efforts. This means that we have to be in constant connection and, importantly, really listen, be flexible, adapt, change our service, to meet all the varying contexts, and to accept compromise in our core principles of work. We've moved purposefully from an authority of top-down controller, advisor, technocrat to being an innovative knowledge base, a facilitator, and a sounding board. Our strategic intention is to support sustainable practices, to empower active involvement and leadership by the communities with whom we have the privilege to work. An excellent local South Australian example of this is ArtLab's partnership in 23-24 with the Australian Library and Information Association, ALIA, the History Trust of South Australia, and the South Australian Fire and Emergency Services Commission, which is SAFECOM. It's the first time in South Australia, and we understand nationally, that the cultural heritage sector and the emergency management sector have come together to connect. The aim was to build a shared approach to disaster resilience. We worked together to integrate collections disaster preparedness into the broader emergency planning, and we delivered disaster preparedness workshops for staff and volunteers in local museums and public libraries. SAFECOM's motivation in this wasn't just about preserving the social infrastructure, the buildings, but its extent or the collections, but it was really about recognising those two things together, that they sustain the core values that bind community and support recovery. Secondly, building on collaboration is the need to zoom out, to look at the big picture and to focus our efforts in a strategic, holistic way. Risk management is obviously deeply embedded in all that we do. Increasingly here, the Government of South Australia is driving an integrated and multi-stakeholder coordination approach. This really underpins going right back 40 years to how ArtLab was established as a consolidated conservation service. We're strongly aligned and we're embedded in the work of the cultural institutions, but we remain an autonomous organisation that looks right across and provides advice and recommendations about the current state, the future needs, and where targeted investment should go, looking at the collections as a whole. Naturally, preventive conservation strategies are number one. To that end, the South Australian Government has invested in the development of a new shared collection storage facility. It's currently being built. It has a focus on stable and sustainable environmental conditions, access and security. Next on the list, broadly, will be about addressing the unique challenges of preserving the physical audiovisual materials due to their the very narrow window of time that we have to reformat them before they degrade. Then there's data. We all know that it's essential to collect, and gee, we really are doing so. But what's more important is analysis and interpretation. Governments and other key stakeholders, including philanthropists, make decisions based on solid evidence. We're seeing other parts of the arts and creative sector, and I'm thinking particularly about the performing and definitely beyond the cultural heritage sector, doing a lot of and being really good at doing a lot of analysis and really good at communicating it. So there's plenty of models out there for us to adapt. Right now at Art Lab, I'm exploring models that demonstrate the cost of action and, importantly, the cost of inaction. This isn't an attempt to argue to preserve everything, but rather a powerful way to articulate the implications, to help make the case, and to inform decisions. Building on the value of data is the strategic imperative to leverage technology, and really fantastic to listen to Seb's insights about how that's happening broadly in museums and galleries. At Art Lab, we're in the infancy to explore AI, and also to hear those reflections about, whether it is the be all and end all, and whether it really is leading to productivity. But we can see that if it's used ethically, we hope that there's opportunities for it to make efficiencies in areas of research, documentation, data analysis, the design of storage, travel and packing systems, and our administration. The hope is that in times of constrained resources, that this will free up conservators to do their expert work. So armed with good relationships and data, our next key strategy to sustain and build capacity in Art Lab is advocacy. To do our work, we need friends and champions. Advocacy requires a compelling demonstration of why what we do is important. It's not just about sharing information, it's about empowering others to take action on the issues that we promote. So for us, strategic advocacy requires consistency, a real demonstration of our niche, why we're special, what's different, why we're unique, and a mixed platform. But what we're finding is that inviting people in, getting in behind the scenes, seeing the work in action, that special opportunity to get up close to collections is really the golden ticket. The impact is palpable, and it's so easy to convey. Most vital in doing that is letting the people who do the work, the conservators, share their stories, their energy, their passion, their intellect. No one sells conservation better than them. So people, it's all about people. Our greatest strength at Art Lab is our people. Every day they bring duty and resourcefulness to their work. It's crucial that they're supported, developed and showcased. And right now, in times of crisis, the strategic focus really is on supporting them to sustain their own energy and helping them to find ways to cope with high levels of discomfort in this world of great disruption. Particularly with conservators as highly valued individuals with a really strong focus on quality, some people say perfectionists, it's not easy for us to tolerate increasing demands, prioritisation, flexible conservation approaches, and doing more with less. So my final thoughts in thinking about talking today is that strategically for Art Lab as an organisation, and more broadly, I think in the cultural heritage sector, I believe the key action is to identify and invest in the forward-thinking individuals, the ones with vision. Peak bodies like AusHeritage, Amaga, ICOMOS, AICCM, ICOM, INTAC, all the people that we've been hearing about today, they all have an excellent history of identifying strategic thinkers, fostering collaboration, keeping ahead of the curve, and chipping away to drive the sector forward. And in times of crisis, the importance of doing this is ever so more essential. I've really enjoyed today. Sessions like today provide a platform to inspire and to enable collective future planning. There's certainly a lot to do. I've been thinking about, the opportunities to build a much bigger, broader, shared conference that could, actually lead to a statement of future intentions and pathways. What we all want to do is cultivate an environment where courage is embraced and creativity and fresh ideas are celebrated. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was really, really clear exposition, and I wish you all the best. And I'm really thrilled that you are a fellow member of the board of AusHeritage. Okay, our final speaker is Peter Romy. Peter's had more than 40 years' experience in most aspects of heritage conservation, working in consultancy firms, government organisations, and as a World Heritage Site Manager. He specialises in the provision of strategic input into the development and management of heritage buildings and places. He's also participated in many cases at the Land and Environment Court as an expert witness and in preparing independent peer reviews of heritage reports. Peter is a coordinator of the Australia ICOMOS World Heritage Reference Group, responsible for providing high-level advice to governments and ICOMOS regarding issues affecting World Heritage places, both in Australia and internationally. He's regularly called upon to provide reports regarding World Heritage matters to ICOMOS headquarters in Paris and the UNESCO World Heritage Centre. He's also a past deputy chair and board member of AusHeritage and has undertaken numerous visits to Asia, including Taiwan and Malaysia, to encourage best practice heritage conservation, share ideas and develop capacity building. Peter will speak to the implications for World Heritage management. Welcome, Peter.
I just need to acknowledge in the first instance, I live and work on the unceded lands of the Guringai people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. In the first part of this presentation, I will focus on some of the more troubling aspects of heritage in a time of crisis and uncertainty, but I'll conclude with some more positive observations about some recent trends and initiatives that we are seeing in the Southeast Asian region. Perhaps the single most certain observation we can make today is that there isn't much certainty really. And to a degree, that's always been the case, I think. But although I noted what Professor Bisley said about that, I think what's different now, the particular threats to what I would term our local or everyday heritage, the intangible and intangible evidence of who we are as communities and how we got here. I'll get onto that in a moment, but I'll just start at the big end of town. Some of you will be aware of the fraught relationship between the United States and the United Nations over time, particularly the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. This relationship has failed once again when the US State Department in July announced that the US would pull out of UNESCO. Here are a couple of recent announcements that leave us in no doubt about how the US President views international cooperation and support for cultural heritage around the world. So here we see the President with a quote from the White House Deputy Spokesperson Anna Kelly, who told the New York Post, President Trump has decided to withdraw the United States from UNESCO, which supports woke, divisive, cultural and social causes that are totally out of step with the common sense policies that Americans voted for in November. A State Department spokesman, Tammy Bruce, said UNESCO works to advance divisive social and cultural causes. And that's gone too far. Oh, sorry, what's happened there? Social causes and maintains an outsized focus on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, a globalist ideological agenda for international development at odds with our America First foreign policy. So I'm not sure with Professor Bisley is still with us, but I love his term victimised nationalism. I don't know if there's a better example of victimised nationalism than this. Although a key focus of UNESCO is world rather than local or everyday heritage, these announcements reveal how politicised, how weaponised an appreciation and support for cultural heritage can become. Moreover, these attitudes can and often do trickle down to how local and everyday heritage is valued and managed to the detriment of our owner communities. And just further to this, I'll just go to the next slide. The US ECOMOS annual conference this year was cancelled, which is an unprecedented thing. The statement about that was quite diplomatic in its terms, but it's quite clear that it's because of uncertainty over funding and just acceptability of cultural heritage on being on the same stage as other more important things. Meanwhile, in Australia and elsewhere, housing shortages and the cost of living pressures are putting increasing strain on the established processes that have evolved over decades to identify and conserve our heritage places. The situation is being portrayed as, by some governments at least, and vested interests, as an either-or scenario. Heritage is sometimes portrayed as a luxury that we can no longer afford and is standing in the way of the intensification of development that society requires to address housing shortages. Local and everyday heritage is particularly at risk under this either-or formula. These images illustrate the sort of housing developments that are being created on greenfield sites on the edges of our cities. So just go back for that one. Just on the edges of our cities. The next slide is the humble, high-density late 19th century housing developments that typified our inner city suburbs. And finally, and we have the next slide. And finally, what can be the outcome of the outcome or the result of new infill development in a uncomfortable heritage context? So increased development controls leading to this kind of scenario. While there are many factors that affect housing supply and the cost of living, we can only hope that under a democratic system at least, with the moderating effects of time and input from those with the expertise to walk and chew gum at the same time, creative and sustainable approaches can be developed to achieve a balanced, if not perfect, way forward. I expect that some of you participating in this symposium today might be engaged in the process of looking for that balance. The next slide, if that's okay. Meanwhile, at the international level, and notwithstanding the difficulties that we have being faced by UNESCO, competition to achieve the goal of World Heritage listing has probably never been more intense. There are now 1,248 places on the World Heritage list, with 26 places having been added at the recent World Heritage Committee meeting in Paris. That was in July. None of those 26 places were in the United States, by the way. So this slide illustrates the distribution of World Heritage places in 2025. Asia and the Pacific is now the region with the second highest number of inscribed properties after Europe and North America. A very different situation from the early decades of the World Heritage list. Indeed, China, with 60 places inscribed now, is second only to Italy with 61. So that's a very strong trend over recent years. That positive trend at the World Heritage level to achieve recognition of outstanding universal value across all cultures, not just European heritage places that previously dominated the World Heritage list in the early days. There have been some other interesting trends as well, particularly for the listing of serial and transboundary properties. That is, listings of multiple properties across a number of countries. There are now 51 transboundary properties on the World Heritage list. Next slide, please. One of the more interesting transboundary properties is the architectural work of architect Le Corbusier, which was inscribed in 2016 and includes sites across Argentina, Belgium, France, Germany, India, Japan, and Switzerland. The fact that the governments of 7 countries spread across the world, including India and Japan in Asia, were able to cooperate and work collaboratively to achieve international recognition for this aspect of their shared heritage can only be seen as a positive outcome. So, next slide, please, Penny. So, in returning to our region, for me, it has been very gratifying to see how heritage conservation methodologies have evolved and become more sophisticated and collaborative since I first became involved in the work of AusHeritage in the late 2000s. At that time, we saw our role as capacity building and encouraging awareness of best practice conservation methodology in Southeast Asia in particular. I have taken many visits in that role as what I might call a heritage missionary. In recent years, though, next slide, please, Penny. In recent years, though, we have not only seen wider international recognition of Asia's cultural heritage through the World Heritage System, but I think there is a much greater awareness, collaboration, and sharing of expertise in the identification, protection, and management of tangible and intangible heritage places and values in the region. Recently, I was invited to present a paper at a series of online seminars, which is what we're looking at now, organised by ECOMOS Malaysia. The focus of the webinars, it was a series of webinars, was the use of heritage impact assessments to assess the potential impacts of development in the heritage places. The speakers were from countries across Asia, including Malaysia, Japan, Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Taiwan, Nepal, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia. I'm happy to say that there are many such initiatives occurring across Asia now, which is a reflection of the value that governments, organisations, and communities place on their cultural heritage and their commitment to its conservation for succeeding generations. Next slide, please, Penny. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. There are no open questions. We're slightly over time, so I'm just going to do a quick wrap up and thank you. And first of all, I'll give Vinod's apologies. He's had to dash off onto another meeting, so I'm going to do the quick wrap up and thank yous. And thank you, first of all, to the brilliant speakers. Thank you for agreeing to speak. Thank you for preparing so well. Thank you for being so thought-provoking. I'm incredibly appreciative. Thank you also to the fabulous team at the University of Melbourne, Penny Tripp, Tim Auld, Katie Painter, and Stamatina Hasiotis. As always, you're superb and professional. Key themes, well, I have lots of key themes, but I won't run through them all with you, but just things really pop out. First of all, that the current turbulence is likely to be the new normal internationally. The importance of supporting people, the importance of being flexible, the importance of community and collaboration and alliances. And finally, from Kathy, I love it, the opportunity for us to step up and be transformational and do transformational work is really exciting and terrifying at the same time. A recording of the symposium will be available on AusHeritage's YouTube channel next week, so make sure you have a look at that and make more notes of the things that you didn't pick up the first time around. And again, please visit our website for any other information or for interesting stuff to come up. Please think about joining if you're able to. So sorry about the few minutes over. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you and good afternoon. Bye.